Good evening. It's my pleasure to host and moderate this distinguished E-Symposium conducted by Trend Research and Advisory. My name is Ahmed Al-Safti. I'm a visiting Associate Professor of Practice at the American University in Cairo, specializing in economics, and the Managing Director of the Research Center. Today, we have a very distinguished panel of very distinguished experts in economics. And I'm going to, at the beginning, to provide a sort of a very brief background about the participants in this forum titled COVID-19 and the Global Economy Effects and Repercussions. First, we have Dr. Wen Wang, the Executive Dean of Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies. Dr. Wen Yang is the Executive Dean of Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies and Vice President of Silk Road School, Renmin University of China. He has visited nearly 100 countries, including the South Pole, and has conducted extensive research and field investigations. He was the co-chairman of T20 in 2016 and is the managing director of the Silk Road Think Tank Association. He also serves as a consultant expert for the People's Bank of China and at China Foreign Finance and Commerce Ministries. Dr. Wang specializes in global governance, significant power relations, green finance, and macroeconomics policies. We have lots of things about Dr. Wang, but just for this time, I will introduce our second distinguished speaker, Dr. Omar Al-Ubaidli, the Director of Research at Dirasat, Bahrain. Dr. Omar is the Director of Research at Dirasat, Bahrain, an affiliated Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University, and an affiliated Senior Research Fellow at the Repercussions Center. His research interests include political economy, experimental economics, and the economics of the GCC countries. He has served as a member of the Commonwealth of Virginia's Joint Advisory Board of Economists and a visiting professor of economics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Al-Ubaidli regularly publishes his research in international peer-reviewed academic journals, and his mainstream media articles appear in Arabic and English language newspapers and blogs such as Al-Hayat, The National, Forbes Opinion, and US News. Dr. Al-Ubaidli earned his BA in economics from the University of Cambridge and his MA and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Our third distinguished guest is Mr. Ahmed Al-Turbak, the lead economist in governmental institution at Abu Dhabi. Mr. Ahmed is a Saudi national with a master's in economics and finance from the UK. Mr. Ahmed has served as an economist for Saudi Arabia's Supreme Economic Council, advising on macroeconomic issues and cost-cutting government policies. He also led a project to assess the Saudi FDI landscape and recommended government reforms. In the UAE, Mr. Ahmed has worked in the private sector, management consultancy, and the private equity space. For 2.5 years, beginning 2016, Mr. Ahmed worked at the World Bank Group's headquarters in Washington, D.C., focusing on its portfolio with Bahrain, Qatar, and UAE, and Oman. He had led and participated in development strategies, project, and supported clients in setting up monitoring and evaluating systems. In February 2019, Mr. Ahmed joined an Abu Dhabi-based government entity as a lead economist, where he serves to date. He leads the entity's economic research and strategic partnership on Latin America and Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and Central and South Asia region. Finally, we have the pleasure to have Mr. Federico Bonaglia. Mr. Federico is the Deputy Director of the OECD Development Center. Mr. Bonaglia supports the Director in establishing the strategic directions and implementing the program of work of the Development Center, ensuring that the Center's analysis and advice remain at the forefront of policy thinking and procedure results. He provides leadership to strengthen the development centers, engaging in impact with Africa, Latin America, and global governance processes, as well as in several thematic areas such as migration and development. Natural resources and many other things. So I hope that we will have a very interesting session under those special circumstances. We have, of course, the situation of COVID-19 and the impact on the economy. But as we can see now, it brought us closer together from all around the world to be able to discuss the impact of COVID-19. So first, I will invite Dr. Wang to take the floor and to present his presentation about what's going to be the short and medium term impact of COVID-19 on the global economy. So Dr. Wang, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So how many minutes can I have present?
20 minutes.
20 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, thank you for having me to share my views. As a leading think tank in China, my institute, Chongyang Institute for Financial Study, Renmin University of China, RDCY, is concentrating on providing decision-making advice and thought service for the global government and China's development. I hope that some of my thoughts can be helpful for you. So actually, facing this unknown, unexpected disease, China launched big battles, very big battles to COVID-19 for 5 months, and controlled basically COVID-19 spreading since the end of the February. But the problem is that in the past 4 months, there are no infections in most parts of the China. But most of people who live in China still wear masks to prevent the transmission of COVID-19. And on June 15th, Beijing, my living city, the capital of China, reported new domestically transmitted COVID-19 cases. There are about 10 daily new confirmed cases now, since the middle of this month. And this further makes us realize that the pandemic is turning into a protracted war. No one can relax. Even as you may know, in China, totally, in the past 5 months, totally, China only below 9,000 cases. But in my aspect, COVID-19 now is putting humanity in an unprecedented crisis. Firstly, global crisis of life. By the end of June this month, as we all know, over 10 million people were infected by COVID-19 worldwide, and 500,000 people died because of it. And a second relapse has occurred as a result of premature opening of the economy in some countries. You know those countries. And currently, there are more than 200 kinds of vaccines under development globally. But the scientists have discovered that 40 variants of COVID-19 have appeared. So the development of vaccines may have difficulties keeping up with the rate of the change. So the most optimistic estimate is that it would still need to take at least half a year to wait for the vaccine to be successfully developed. And affected by the economic and the medical conditions, the most pessimistic estimate is that if humans cannot produce vaccines and special drugs for the COVID-19 in short term, more than 1 billion people will be infected from the 7.7 billion people in the world. So, and about nearly 70 million people will die because of the COVID-19. It's terrible estimate. I mean, this is a very pessimistic estimate. So the death, the death number will far exceed the scale of the 50 million deaths caused by the Spanish flu in 1918, and even exceed the number of the deaths in the World War II. So that means the COVID-19 virus may cause unprecedented damage to the human life since the 15th centuries. So secondly, the global economic crisis. The pandemic has had a devastating impact on the catering, retail, tourism, film, air transport, and other industries. The global travel market is freezing. A total of 7 airline companies around the world have bankrupted now. And many well-known brands have suspended store or go bankrupt during of the pandemic. IMF forecast recently, last week, the global growth in 2020 to be minus 4.9%. And the World Bank forecast 2 weeks ago, 5.2% decline. And OECD estimate at minus 6% by 2020. So, but all of these are based on the premise that there is a vaccine and no second reoccurrence. So in any case, the global economy is facing its worst recession since the World War II, and far worse than the 2008 international financial crisis. So it is estimated that the economic recession will lead to a decline in international trade and cross-border investment of at least 30% in 2020, and triggering the next round of debt, financial, energy, and the other second disasters, such as the food crisis. So, but in fact, as early of middle March, I wrote an articles about it. I said in middle March, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic should be measured by the Great Depression of 1930s. So this is second. And thirdly, the global social crisis. Impact of the pandemic is intensifying the structural reshaping of the relation among countries, such as localization and regionalization of industrial chain. So travel bans, immigration controls, and even border closures are becoming a new normal for many countries. As a result, the flow of factors is more difficult. International exchange are limited, and production and trade activities are declining or stagnating. So all of these fragile globalization, even worse than before. So more than 200 million people around the world are at risk of unemployment and income plummeting by 2020. And the unemployment rate has caused a serious social disorder and disruptions in some countries. And for example, racial conflict in US nowadays, in the past many weeks. At present, the wave of anti-racism protests has spread to many Western countries. Pandemic, unemployment rate, and civil rights movements hit an already fragile world society. And the biggest fear now is that the unemployment and social instability may lead to local wars and geopolitical conflicts, and the most serious disorder of human society since the end of the World War II may be underway. So at present, people's knowledge of the virus is still very limited. If the virus can be linked to an alien invention, then the new world war, has come to the height of the defending human civilization. So if the human race does not unite, it will encounter the worst dark age in the history of human modern civilization. So this is my first part of my presentation. My second part is that I feel very sad because unfortunately, not everyone in the world is as aware of the dangers of the global pandemic as I am, as I said right now. So we feel that human pandemic is facing three obstacles. The first is anti-Semitism. Some people don't believe in medicine, and they think freedom is more important than life. They are reluctant to wear masks and just regard the COVID-19 as a fruit, as a big fruit. So at present, a considerable number of people are infected for die together, gathering, party, carnival. So many people still take chances that the probability of the infection is very, very low, and that they will not get infected. So it has been proved, however, that wearing masks, washing hands frequently, and staying home can slow down the infection curve in various countries. So what I want to say is that to despise science is to despise human civilization. So there is no point in talking about freedom without respecting science, without respecting life. This is the first obstacle. The second obstacle is anti-globalism. Nowadays, I call it a shock of the globalization. The shock of globalization is in line with the ideas of some anti-globalists. Some governments not only desire to support the domestic populism within their country, adopt protectionism trade policy and placing restrictions on immigration and visa. So, but also withdraw from many international organizations and agreements. You know what I want to say, which countries I want to point at. So, but the truth is different. So as human beings are closely connected with each other, no country can ignore the global problems such as refugee, climate change, pandemic, and so on. Yeah, we all know. The third is anti-cooperation. So I said that the first is anti-Semitism, second is anti-globalism, third is anti-cooperation. As long as there are confirmed cases in any countries, it is impossible to declare the end of the pandemic, as well as restart the economy. Nowadays in China, we have no relax, because in Beijing every day we have around 10 new cases. So in order to transfer domestic contradictions, some countries attempted to bring other countries and attack other countries, and they also cut off funding for WHO, indirectly putting countries in need of support from the WHO in more dangerous situation. So I think the country which unilaterally believe in supremacism or the priority of their nation, so ignore the common interest of the mankind. This is very, very sad. So my opinion is that cooperation, international cooperation, is the only way to solve the global problems. So that's second part. Final part, the third, the final. So I think, so how can we do? So today, so I think that today's meeting is very, very important. So I have three very pragmatic suggestions. First, life is a priority. So in the face of the disaster, it is a basic responsibility of governments and human essential nature to protect the life of citizens. We should protect women, children, and elderly, weak groups to ensure the basic livelihood of the people. So behind the loss of the single life is a breakdown of the family. So it is our highest priority to attach greater importance to the life of the human being in the face of the disasters. Secondly, share medical information and jointly development of vaccines with each other. For the past 40 decades, we have not yet developed the successful treatment for AIDS, and we cannot afford to do the same thing again. 40 years passed, we still have no any vaccines for AIDS. So now, this is a very tragedy historical lesson. So most of the achievements of the science community are the result of the cooperation, and every breakthrough is based on the achievements of predecessors. So in the face of such a wide variety of values, no country can develop vaccines independently. So therefore, the only way for people to defeat the virus is to share medical information and achievements unreservedly and work together to develop vaccines to save lives. Thirdly, finally, coordination efforts to increase the momentum of micro policy and prevent the world economy from falling into a great recession. This includes, but is not limited to, implementing of effective fiscal and monetary policies to maintain the basic stability of currency exchange rate of all countries, strengthening the coordination of the financial supervision to maintain the stability of the global financial market, and then jointly maintaining the stability of the global industrial supply chain. So as well as jointly expanding cooperation in new industrials such as digital economy, smart city, clean energy, and 5G network. So avoiding the world financial crisis again and the Great Depression of the past pandemic is just as important as fighting the disease. So last but not least, so in such a highly globalized world today, no one person or country is an isolated island. Mankind now has reached an unprecedented critical stage that we must cooperate and unite to get ourselves out of this crisis. So that's all. Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang, for a very informative and reality check for the situation of COVID-19. It's very interesting. I received many questions, but I will let the questions be during the last part, during the open discussion, if you don't mind, because I have many. And some of the questions, I think, it's directed towards all the panel. It's not only for yourself, but thank you again for the very interesting and very sobering point of view about the situation of COVID-19 and what should be done in order to for humanity to get over the problem. Okay, So thank you again. And now we have our second distinguished speaker, Dr. Omar Al-Obaidli. And Dr. Omar Al-Obaidli is going to talk to us about COVID-19 and unprecedented shock to the supply and demand sides of the global economy. So Dr. Omar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking Trends for the invitation to participate today and to Dr. Ahmed for chairing the session. It's quite appropriate that we're having this session at the same time as Dr. Anthony Fauci is presenting his testimony before the Senate regarding the coronavirus. The reason being that one of the major problems that I will be discussing, which Dr. Wen alluded to, is the continuation of the persistence of a high degree of uncertainty regarding the attributes of the virus and regarding how to deal with it. There's been a lot of between country differences, a lot of international differences, and a lot of differences within countries, such as within the USA, in terms of the intensity of lockdowns, in terms of when lockdowns have started, when lockdowns have finished, how strong those lockdowns and strictly that they've been. So even in the case of China, I believe Beijing at the moment is under a renewed lockdown, whereas significant parts of the country have a lot more freedom, whereas at the beginning of the crisis, it was Wuhan that was under lockdown. And in the US, obviously, most states are open now fully, but even within the US, there have been significant variation in terms of the exact opening times. Now, despite, in principle, because we have so much variation in terms of lockdown start dates and intensity, this should allow us to get a good sense of the impact of lockdowns on the health outcomes and on the economic outcomes. We should be able to compare, how things have developed according to the differential application of the lockdowns. But the reality is that when you look at the data, there's no obvious relationship between lockdowns and outcomes. Just to give you some examples that illustrate this, we have countries that have imposed a strict and prolonged lockdown, but that have suffered bad health outcomes and bad economic outcomes, with examples being the UK and the US. They've had very high death rates compared to the rest of the world, and their economies are suffering heavily. In the case of the US, I believe 40 million people almost were unemployed at one point. Yet this has come despite the fact they've imposed quite strict lockdowns. Then you have a second group that have imposed strict, prolonged lockdowns, but they've experienced relatively good health and economic outcomes. Their examples would be somewhere like Australia and Germany, both of which have had relatively low death rates. And in the case of the Australian economy, the impact has been relatively mild. Of course, everyone's damaged, but it's been relatively benign in Australia. Then you have countries that have avoided lockdowns and suffered very bad health and economic outcomes. And here the most salient example is Brazil at the moment, where it seems to be going in suffering heavily. And then finally, you've got a group of countries that have avoided lockdowns and that have experienced, again, relatively good health outcomes and economic outcomes. Here you have South Korea being a good example, or Singapore. Now, both of them have recently had to impose some degree of lockdown or slightly stricter lockdowns, but they're still not as strict as what was imposed in places such as Italy or the UK at various junctures. Sweden lies somewhere between the third and fourth groups because it has avoided lockdowns, but has suffered some significant economic and health damage. In the case of South Korea, I believe the latest IMF estimate was that its economy would contract in 2020 by only 1.2%, which is, fantastic compared to the other countries across the world. In addition to this, so this just gives you an idea of how there's no obvious relationship between lockdowns and outcomes. Experts can't even agree if there's a trade-off between the economy and the health. So you have two views among experts. One group of experts thinks that lockdowns are potentially good for tackling health issues, but they cause huge economic damage because people can't interact, people can't go to work, people can't buy goods, people can't buy services. And then it's a case of deciding when the health aspects merit the economic damage. That's one group. But then there's another group, including many high-profile economists, who think that there's no trade-off, that the only way you'll get the economy operating well is if you have the health situation under control. And this is what Dr. Wen was referring to at the beginning when he said that despite the fact that China has surpassed the worst of the virus, people still remain scared, people still wear masks, and they can't behave as if they used to behave. And I'm not going to get into the who's right. I just want to show you that I'm talking about elite experts in every country don't agree on this issue, don't agree on whether there's a trade-off or not. Now, why is it that despite the strength of views on what we should or shouldn't be doing, we still don't really observe a relationship, an obvious empirical relationship between lockdowns and health and economic outcomes? There's 4 reasons for this that I want to draw attention to. The first is what I'll call voluntary social distancing. So people do not just socially distance because the government tells them to or because the government mandates it. People socially distance because unilaterally as an act of self-preservation or as an act of conformity. And this is exacerbated by the availability of global media. So whereas you referenced Dr. Ahmed at the beginning of the Spanish flu, in the days of the Spanish flu, the time it takes for news of what's going on in China to reach the west coast of the America would have been potentially weeks, whereas now it's 5 seconds maximum, and we know exactly what's going on in China. So people do not wait for the government to tell them that they should stay 2 meters away from other people, or that they shouldn't go out, or that they shouldn't get sushi, or shouldn't have a haircut, or shouldn't go to the cinema. They take these actions themselves. And what this implies is that even though you impose a lockdown, people, so even if you haven't imposed a lockdown, people might be behaving as if there's a lockdown. And conversely, and to some extent, that's what happened in Sweden. People were voluntarily socially distancing, even though the government only put very mild restrictions on what people were supposed to do. And obviously, and you can have the reverse, where you can have a situation where people, the government imposes a lockdown, but people choose to ignore what the government does. And in some countries, the military have been deployed to ensure conformity, but this has not been used everywhere. And in many Western countries, the governments have had to rely on people, using their common sense to. But if people don't want to, then the lockdowns are not effective. So what this does is it creates a distinction between the imposition of a lockdown and the effectiveness of a lockdown, because people behave differently to a lockdown. And you've probably all seen the Google data on how much people have been going to work and going to the retail sector. And if you look at that data, my colleague William Luther from Florida International University has a paper on SSRN about this. If you look at the data in the US states, for example, in most states, people, before the imposition of a strict lockdown by the government, before the stay-at-home orders were issued by the state governor, the people had reduced their movement almost to the level that became the result of the stay-at-home orders. So this shows you how difficult it is to get a sense of the actual impact of lockdowns. The second reason is economic interdependence. And here Sweden is a very good example. The economy today, again, compared to the Spanish flu example you gave, Dr. Ahmed, is a lot more interdependent, especially globally. There's a lot more global supply chains, but also in demand. I mean, in terms of tourism, in terms of civil aviation, all sorts of services cross borders, and even within borders across, state boundaries, regional boundaries, and certainly across municipal boundaries. And what this means is that even if a country is able to completely eliminate any health problems associated with the COVID, if other people are still suffering in other countries, then that country's economy will still be affected heavily, or that geographical unit's economy will still be heavily affected. We take the example of New Zealand, which has been relatively successful in controlling the pandemic, But New Zealand is a small, open economy. And if New Zealand can't trade, if people from New Zealand can't visit other countries and vice versa, then its economy will be heavily affected. The same for Sweden. So Sweden, despite the fact that it hasn't imposed a lockdown, is expected to have an economic contraction of the order of 9% this year, which is comparable to what many other countries which have imposed lockdowns are experiencing. And that's, again, directly the result of the economic interdependence. A big country like China is able to, if it can control things domestically, rebound economically more quickly. And actually, we're seeing that in the case of China because it doesn't depend on trade so much. But in the case of a small country like Bahrain, where I'm from, or New Zealand, there's no hope. The third reason is that, and this is one of Donald Trump's favorites, is that testing isn't homogeneous. So at the same time that we're seeing increasing cases, we're also seeing increased testing. The testing environment is not consistent either across time within a country or between countries. And so it's difficult to determine whether changes in the incidence of COVID-19 reflect changes in the underlying incidence of COVID-19 or just the detection of COVID-19. And in the US, for example, we had at one point very low, very poor testing infrastructure at the beginning. And now Trump's complaining that we have testing infrastructure that's too good. And so he wants it to be decreased in quality. But anyway, throughout the world, the testing infrastructure is improving and changing. And so this makes it much harder to determine, to interpret the data that we see. And the fourth reason is behavioral fatigue. People are fed up with social distancing. So this is, and you've seen pictures, I think the beach in Brighton in the UK from last weekend looked like it was a sunny day in 2010. And in Italy and Spain, I see the cafes and restaurants are full. People have reached a stage, and this again definitely applies to the US in many states, people have reached a stage where they'll be happy to take their chances and they're no longer interested in adhering to the rules. So the implication of this is that policies seem to be ineffective. We'd expect to see very big differences in economic and health outcomes depending as a response to differences in policy, but actually we see a lot more homogeneity in outcomes than we would expect. And also we're seeing a lot less trust in experts. So we already are, in the last 10 years, people have been diminishing their trust in experts. We saw that in the case of Brexit, the UK exit from the European Union. In many respects, the election of Donald Trump in the US was a way of saying that people in the US do not trust experts. In the European parliamentary elections, we've seen a bigger and bigger share for populist leaders in the last 20 years, and they've reached a stage where they have about 35% of the vote, and that includes extreme left populists and extreme right populists, and both of them are somewhat averse to expert views. And this difficulty of analyzing and interpreting the data relating to the coronavirus is exacerbating this problem of diminished trust in experts. And we saw that in the case of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, where people, since Memorial Day, so the experts predicted something catastrophic from protests. In fact, we've had protests and outdoor sports events and so on, and concerts cancelled for the last 3 months because experts have expected these things to have a very negative effect. We've had protests are probably the worst thing you could do in terms of spreading the disease. People tight next to each other, shouting at each other, spitting, and so on and so forth. But we haven't seen the surge that we expected, or that experts have been telling us will happen. And in the case of schools, we still can't get a straight answer on the issue of schools. I have young children. I'm anxious to know whether schools are scheduled to open in Bahrain in September. I'm anxious to know whether children are a risk, aren't a risk, teachers, etc., etc. Yesterday, I was looking at the guidelines on the Center for Disease Control and all the various formal outlets, and even the formal outlets can't agree on whether children are more likely to get the disease, less likely to get the disease, or as likely but more likely to suffer symptoms, less likely to get some symptoms, more likely to transmit, less likely to transmit. And this is despite the fact that we've spent God knows how much money, and we've dedicated God knows how many, the finest scientific minds have been allocating their time exclusively to this issue, and we still can't get a straight answer. The final point I want to make is that the lockdowns themselves have become highly polarizing issues. If you look at the media and you look at the public discourse, you have people who are strongly in favor of the lockdowns, but you also have people who are completely fed up and want the lockdowns. And in the case of the US, this even reached a stage where people were outside protesting against the lockdowns, and there were some confrontations. But even beyond the US, it's clear, as I mentioned, in the case of Italy and Spain, that many people think the lockdowns are no longer necessary. And the view and this debate is not very civilized. It's very contentious. If you I don't advise it, but if you go to Twitter and read some of the things that are exchanged on it, it's not exactly the most constructive debate. Why is it that the coronavirus, the lockdown debates are so polarizing? We've talked about five. I'll talk about 5 reasons very briefly. The first is that, even in the worst case scenario, like the US, in the US, less than, where they managed it terribly and it's spreading heavily, less than 1% of the population has been diagnosed with COVID. So despite the fact that it's doing very badly, most people still don't know anyone who has COVID. Let alone someone who's died from COVID. This is, so it's spread a lot, but still not to the level where, everyone knows someone who has it. And this means that for a lot of people who don't know people who've had it, then, they're saying, this is a big deal, this is exaggerated. Secondly, the virus is silent and it's an invisible killer. This is unlike something like a war or a natural disaster, or a terrorist attack. Terrorist attacks, natural disasters maybe kill a lot fewer people than the coronavirus, but they're very visceral and very visible events, and scare people a lot more than something like COVID, because they can see something happening. So even if a terrorist might kill 2 people with a suicide bomb, it might scare people a lot more than make people much more in favor of strict countermeasures than COVID, where to many people, it's an invisible killer and it's not something they can tangibly sense. Third, most obviously, the lockdowns have destroyed the livelihoods of many people. If you're a pilot, if you're a flight attendant, if you're a tourist, if you work in tourism, then my friend just posted on Facebook, Cirque du Soleil has declared bankruptcy. These are pillars of modern culture, and they've had their livelihoods destroyed by the fact that people are not going out. So it's understandable that people whose livelihoods have been destroyed are against lockdowns and against closing borders and preventing international travel. Fourth, we have the issue of fake news. There's a lot of malevolent international actors who are actively spreading fake news about the origins of the disease and about how to treat the disease and what works, what doesn't work. And this all serves to undermine public trust and makes people more stuck in their ways. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, populist political currents have been going on for the last 20 years, especially after the global financial crisis. And this populism is generally associated with rejecting experts' views, and experts tend to be the ones who favor lockdowns. So this just first reinforces the antagonism towards them. So to conclude, managing this crisis is difficult. And it's becoming more difficult rather than becoming easier because of things like behavioral fatigue, and because we're not getting certain definitive analyses. We're getting more and more hazy and controversial analyses with the passage of time. So it's becoming harder for governments to control the situation. If many governments who've imposed lockdowns and have lifted them will find it much harder to impose lockdowns and to get people to adhere to them now than they would first time around, because people are fed up and because people don't trust experts anymore. And secondly, media are not necessarily contributing to finding a solution. The media in many cases are contributing to the polarization. They're considered an entity that has its own agenda rather than being an impartial conveyor of information. And in some cases, they're prone to being manipulated, in the case of fake news, in the case of social media outlets. I'm sure you've all followed Facebook being boycotted by various advertisers, and that's potentially that's reflective of this dysfunctional media that we have at the moment. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omar, for the very interesting presentation about the situation of COVID-19. Actually, it's a very interesting point of view, and we can have some sort of dialogue between your point of view and Dr. Wang's point of view, because I think even though that they are complementing each other, but still you can see that there is a range of points of view about the impact of COVID-19 and how we should proceed from this point on. So again, we will have around 30 minutes for discussions. I will, by the end of the symposium, I will choose some of the questions for discussions according to the questions that we received, but at the same time, we can have a sort of the dialogue about the conclusion here and how we can find ways to complement those points of view that being presented in this symposium. So thank you again, Dr. Omar. And now for Mr. Ahmed El-Turbaq, and we are going to have his talk under the title, What are the likely implications of COVID-19 on the economies of the Arab Gulf countries and the UAE? So please, Mr. Ahmed, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, and the distinguished speakers. As my colleague Omar mentioned, thanks to Trends for this opportunity to be part of this symposium. So I will build, as Dr. Ahmed said, the title of this session intended to focus on the economic impact or the likely economic impact on the GCC countries, including the UAE. But of course, as both my previous colleagues mentioned, the GCC is an open economy, is part of the global economy, and both the effects from a health point of view as well as from an economic point of view is interconnected with the rest of the world. So I will share, I have a few slides that I would like to share with everyone. And before we start, I just want to, I don't know if this is visible to everyone, the screen.
It's visible, Dr. Ahmed.
Okay.
We can see it.
Just, sorry. Okay. Is the screen, the slides enlarged?
The slides are fine, I think.
Okay.
It's not enlarged, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay. So what I wanted, as I said, I wanted to build on some of the points that my colleagues mentioned. So what we have seen that, of course, from a health point of view, this is a tragedy and a huge issue affecting the world. Unfortunately, many lives have been lost. Many lives have been affected by this virus. But also the virus and its the range of public policies that all countries around the world have had to take to combat this virus had significant economic impact globally. So I wanted to focus on in this few slides is the economic side of impact on the GCC region. Of course, the economic impact is in the GCC from one side is a result of restrictive measures to combat the virus and to sustain and protect the health and lives of the citizens and residents of the GCC countries. As Dr. Omar mentioned earlier, there is, although the GCC countries have actually contained the health impact of COVID-19 quite good. They kept the cases, number of cases relatively low, and certainly the number and rate of deaths is very much on the low side. Maybe with exception to Saudi Arabia, lately they've had increase or what we hear as a second wave of COVID-19 with the increased level of infection as well as deaths. But in general, the GCC have dealt with it from a health point of view very well, and this is an evidence for the well structured and well infrastructure of the health sector in the GCC and how well it's equipped and financed, both publicly and privately. But to understand the economic side of it, as my colleague mentioned, the world is definitely going into a very deep recession. And this recession is likely to be very deep, and a few similar events from history were mentioned: Great Depression and the crisis of 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, as some sort of similarity or comparison cases. And just to understand this, the 2008, 2009 financial crisis was a huge downturn to global economy. It changed how we do public policy and how we think about financial sectors and how we regulate it and how we live our lives. But just to give a sense, so in 2018 and 2008 and 9 financial crisis, the US, for example, in a year or year and a half where they had the recession, lost almost 4% of its output. So it had a huge impact on the US, obviously on the global economy as well. And as a way, again, of comparison, the latest indications from the US on the economic impact of COVID-19, that the annualized GDP data for just the first quarter of 2020 of this year might suggest that the US have lost the same level of output that the US lost during the financial crisis in a year and a half. So that just shows the likely impact and depth of this expected recession. What's even worse and give a darker view going forward, at least in the short term, that early indications of economic activities, and we're talking about economies where we have access to live data, where we have access to frequent and accessible data, such as the US and some advanced economies, that these early indications show that the contraction in quarter 2 of this year, which goes from April to June, would most likely be even larger and higher than the contraction that we witnessed in quarter 1. So why I'm mentioning that, and obviously the quarter 2 contraction or further contraction in quarter 2, as my colleagues mentioned, due not only just to lower domestic demand and domestic consumption in different economies, but also because of less trade. For instance, early indication of export data in the US shows 35% reduction in exports in quarter 2 for the US. So the picture is quite dark going forward. We've all also heard some the headlines of the unemployment figures in the US surging from less than 500,000 registered unemployed, what they call initial unemployment figures, to above 17 million unemployed person. So this is huge. But the question here is, how will the recovery look like, or likely to look like? So in the beginning of the pandemic in March and early April, and one of our colleagues mentioned the IMF projections. The IMF and many forecasts came out as this is a deep recession. It might be as deep as the financial crisis, and the recovery will be slow, but could be also sharp, as early and as sharp as a V-shaped recovery towards the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021. The longer this uncertainty and changing of views and the COVID-19 is lasting now, these revisions and forecasts have been revised and actually downgraded. So the global consensus now that the recovery story is most likely to be a U shape rather than a V shape. So the economies in the world are not going to just once governments lift restrictions and lockdowns, they're going to go back immediately to production, and households go back to consumption, and private sector go back to investment level as pre-COVID-19. It's rather that these economies will have long-lasting impact to them. So we are already seeing globally and in the region here, many companies exiting the market through bankruptcies and not being able to sustain, not having enough cushions and cash flows to sustain longer measures. And as my colleague also mentioned, even with the lift of and ease of these lockdown measures, people are changing their behavior towards consumption, hoarding some savings, extra savings, and that will eventually make the recovery journey even longer. Also, another angle here is the more bankruptcies and firms exiting the market. We see obviously increasing unemployment, and this is very much important in the GCC region because the situation of the labor markets in the GCC very much reliant on foreign laborers, and these laborers, their existence and their eventually contribution to the economy is linked to their jobs, and once they lose their jobs, the labor markets they're quite rigid, and they don't have the means to have them re-engaged back once the economy is recovered. The only option for them is to leave and leave the country and go back to their home countries. So this is also an extra level of policy issues that the GCC have to learn from as a lesson learned going forward in the future. So again, the whole story here is that the impact is stronger, and the recovery is most likely to be weaker and more gradual going forward than previously anticipated. And just quickly presenting some numbers, we said that IMF revised some figures. So the global economy, the first projections in April, where the global economy will contract by 3%. Now the revision is, as Dr. Wang mentioned, is up to minus 4.9% contraction in the global economy. Advanced economies are likely to see or take the biggest hit because of this COVID-19. And I'm here presenting some figures for the GCC, and again, it's the same story here for the GCC. We see contraction across the board, but the story again is likely to get even worse. Unfortunately, we only have figures revised for Saudi Arabia, and it's actually downgraded from a contraction from minus 2.3% to over 6.8% contraction in 2020. So it doesn't look very promising. But again, these are projections. So there is a lot of externalities and a lot of assumptions here, whether the COVID-19 will have longer and lasting presence and existence, especially here in the GCC. We are seeing, as I said in the beginning of this session, early indication that we might have second wave in Saudi Arabia, increasing rates. Does that mean that some GCC countries, especially Saudi Arabia, will reimpose some of the restrictive measures and some of the lockdowns? And that obviously will have even further pressure on growth rates for this year. So because we don't have live data for the GCC, one of the ways to get sense of how things are in the GCC is to look at this indicator that I'm showing is the Purchasing Manager Index, the PMI, which the three countries that are tracked in this index in the GCC are Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. And this index basically assesses the performance of the non-oil sector in these countries. So we see that, especially for Saudi Arabia and UAE, there is a downward trend even before the outbreak of COVID-19, most likely related to the decrease of oil prices and oil revenues to these GCC governments. But the real decline, and this index basically, the way it measured is above 50 is considered an expansion in the private sector, and below 50 is a contraction. So the real contraction and real plunge here is with the start of the imposing of the restrictive measure by the GCC government around March of this year. So there is a strong evidence, as we said, that not only there is a demand shock in the GCC caused by, the lockdown measures. People are not going out, they're not spending, they're not. So the consumer spending is lower than before the pandemic, but also because of globalization and how these countries are connected to the world through trade. There is also a supply side shock. And for the demand side, as some of my colleagues highlighted, the sectors that are highly affected or mostly affected are obviously tourism, hospitality, retail sectors. And we can draw a line here to countries, even within the GCC, that have higher share of these sectors within their total economies, such as the UAE have highest share of hospitality and tourism amongst the GCC in their economies. So these are in a much more vulnerable situation than some of the other countries. Excuse me, it's just so for the GCC, also the other side of the story, not only the health impact and the needed government policies to restrict movement of people and trade and closing of borders, which then affect economic activities and trade, the GCC on top of that have basically and is suffering from another shock, which is an oil-related shock. So there is even before the outbreak of the coronavirus, there has been the perfect storm basically in the oil price shock. Both excess supply in the market, which is putting downward pressure on the prices, as well as a huge reduction in demand on oil. So this obviously gonna affect the very much hydrocarbon reliant government in the GCC. They rely hugely on revenues from hydrocarbon, and this will have huge implications on growth rates going forward, government revenues, on fiscal space and fiscal options for them, and on their external position going forward. So just this quickly, this slide show that oil prices are we started before the COVID-19, we started the year with oil prices of 65 or $60 per barrel. And we lost almost $40 at the lowest point around April this year. Even with an introduction of OPEC Plus members' agreement to cut production to help increase oil prices and stabilize them, still the gap between total supply and total demand is still huge. And we see that some reopening of major trading partners to the GCC regions, especially in China. It's a huge importer of GCC oil, but this still is not enough to bring oil prices back to where they were before the pandemic. So this again has a huge implication going forward on the GCC. As a whole, we've seen the GCC suffer similar shock when we had 2014 oil crash, and we've seen growth rates after the oil shock of 2014 slash almost by half growth rates from averaging 5 or 6% before the oil crash to nearly 2 and 2.5% after the oil crash. So we are, and we've seen also deterioration of other economic indicators. Public debts increased, fiscal positions and external positions worsened. So we have a similar event that we can draw on and draw lessons from, and see how the GCC public policies helped or not helped in the recovery journey. One of the aspects that we've seen is huge reduction of decrease in public spending after the oil crash in 2014. We might see the same thing. We've seen indications of Saudi Arabia cutting public spending, even benefits for employment, freezing employment. We've seen that in Oman, in Saudi Arabia as well. So these counter-cyclical policies might do more damage, and we've seen them doing more damage in previous events. And again, these are some of the lessons that the GCC policymakers can learn from going forward to tackle this pandemic. And finally, we talked about the GCC as a whole. Individually, obviously, some countries are in better position than others in their journey to recover from the pandemic. Countries with more fiscal buffers, such as Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and obviously the UAE, are in better position to deal with these implications than compared to Bahrain and Oman, where not only public debt levels are high, but also in comparison with other indicators, they are in a much worse position. So this is from my side, and again, thank you for the participation, and look forward to answering some of the questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed, for the very interesting presentation and the clear picture that you gave for the GCC countries and how they are impacted by COVID-19. Sorry, because we are running out of time, but I'll give Mr. Federico Bonaglia the floor to present what have been the direct and indirect effects of COVID-19 on economies around the world based on their respective levels of growth. So the floor is yours, Mr. Federico.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I will try to be brief, being cognizant of the time. Maybe just summarizing up front my three key messages. The first message is that, as many of the previous speakers already underlined, we are confronted with an unseen or unprecedented crisis. And of course, this crisis is putting into question a lot of our understanding of how the global economy function, of national economy function. And it's for the first time that we see a supply side shock triggering a demand side shock that is more than proportional than the supply side shock, and is basically creating global repercussion around the world. But this has already been said by many, so I will not need to repeat it. The second point that I would like to make is that beside the headlines of the global figures about growth and how advanced economies are performing, we should be extremely worried about how emerging and developing economies are performing, because these economies have been the locomotive of development over the last 20 years. And unfortunately, the pandemic and the crisis are putting a brake into the growth prospects of these economies, and are creating a situation whereby a lot of the human progress, of the development progress of the last 20 years is being erased. This will be, 2020 will be the first year in the 21st century where the absolute number of poor people in the world will increase. So I repeat, it is the first year in the 21st century where poverty is not going down. And if you look at the impact of the crisis, the economic crisis, notably the commodity price plunge that has just been discussed, the reduction in demand from large emerging economies like China and others, the internal consequences of lockdown measures in many developing economies is creating a major problem to developing countries, much worse than what we observed in 2008 and 2009. Because if you look at the fiscal position of the majority of developing countries today with respect to 2009, they're entering this crisis, they have entered this crisis with much lower fiscal buffers. Actually, they exhausted the fiscal buffers. On top of that, the crisis is exacerbating a lot of pre-existing vulnerabilities that range from high levels of informality, high dependence on imports, high dependence of export of raw commodities, very low tax revenues, very shallow and very limited reach of healthcare systems and social protection systems that are therefore putting these countries in a much weaker position vis-a-vis OECD economies, for example, in terms of the response that they can take. If you just think about informality, which is widespread, it can go up to 70–80% of employment or GDP in many developing countries. The very fact of having this high level of informality means that the non-pharmaceutical interventions that have proved to be successful in other countries to limit the spread of the pandemic can simply not be put into place. Because people can, in this case, really have to choose between life and livelihood. And so this is creating an additional burden. So if this is the very worrying picture of developing countries, what can we do? Well, Dr. Wang said at the beginning, I mean, we cannot do away from cooperation. I think that international cooperation, a functioning, fair, inclusive, multilateral system is necessary. to restart not only the global economy, but to put the global economy into a better pathway of development, one where we put the environment and people at the center of the recovery, where we move away from a single focus on income and GDP per capita, and we start looking at issues like multidimensional well-being, quality of life, inequality, and intergenerational equity. So for this to happen, of course, governments need to put in place public policies. But the financing of these policies, because of what I just said before, is put in jeopardy because tax revenues and public revenues in general are going down. If you just think about, let's say, Africa, the African average of tax to GDP is about 17%. In Latin America, this is 23%. In the OECD countries, it's 34%. So if you think about the implications of a deceleration in growth, and we heard that growth projections range from -5 to minus almost 8, depending on the scenarios at the global level. But if you think that the impact on tax revenues of a contraction of GDP is more than proportional, this means that tax revenues will decrease because of the crisis more than proportionally than the reduction in GDP. But on top of that, governments are also kind of renouncing to tax revenue because they need to support the economy. And so they are waiving a number of taxes, they're providing longer reliefs, etc., etc. So in these circumstances, I think that the global response needs to be more global. If you just think about the amount of resources that the G20 countries as a whole injected into their economies to support the recovery, I think that this is now in the range of $9 trillion. $9 trillion. If you think about one tool for supporting developing countries, which is official development assistance, the annual volume of official development assistance from the OECD member countries is in the range of 150 billions. You can add to that remittances, you can add to that portfolio investment, you can add to that FDI, but still 9 trillion is what the G20 countries are injecting as a stimulus. 150 billion is what official development assistance aid is contributing to the recovery of developing countries. And for the reason I mentioned before, developing countries are suffering for a lack of domestic resources. So again, putting things in perspective, the IMF projections and the OECD projections for the next year, unfortunately, portray a very bleak picture. The IMF estimated that the cumulative GDP loss due to the crisis is 12.5 trillions. Now, these are numbers with many zeros. I'm not even sure I'm able to write all the zeros. But just to give you an idea, 12.5 trillions is the sum of the economy of Japan, Germany, and India. So you're basically subtracting from the world economy GDP, Japan, Germany, and India. Or if you want, you are subtracting almost China or half of the United States. We're talking about current US dollars, not GDP in PPP terms. So if you think that developing countries are highly dependent on external demand, the fact that the global economy is being contracted by 12 trillion, 12.5, it means that exports, investment, remittances are going to be badly affected. And so the solution here is only to move from a domestic approach to the recovery to a global approach to the recovery, where coalitions like the G20 and beyond need to put the recovery of developing countries into their plate. We should really think in terms of stimulus that is not only targeted to domestic recovery, but to the global recovery. We need to move away from an approach that is based on assistance to an approach which is focused on investment. If you look at the case of the African continent, it's paradoxical. African economies import 94% of all the pharmaceutical and medical related supply. 94% are import. In the multilaterally liberalized trade system that we have been advocating for many decades, when the pandemic struck, 95 countries put in place export restrictions. And so African countries that were relying on imports of this good are confronted with a lack of supply. So how is this possible? Well, it's because domestic production in African countries, domestic manufacturing is not up to where it should be. And so this global investment by promoting industrialization, for example, of African economies is not only increasing the resilience and reducing the vulnerability of these economies to this type of shocks. It's also contributing to a broader agenda of industrialization and development, which is very much needed because the recovery will only be global if every part of the world is part of this recovery. And the pandemic will only be defeated if all the countries in the world will defeat the virus, notably the weakest. So I don't know how many minutes I can still use, but I'm happy to stop here and leave the floor to question and answers if you want, or I have a few slides that I can display, but most of what I wanted to say, I think I managed to say it orally without slides. You tell me.
If you would like to have maybe 5 more minutes, 5 to 7 more minutes.
Okay, then let me just support what I was saying with a few, very few slides that I hope you will be able to see. This is a way that we try to capture the impact of the crisis on developing countries. And as you see, there are impacts that go through the economic sector and the fact that growth is projected to decline. According to the OECD estimates, we have 2 scenarios. In the worst case scenario, if the pandemic hits for a second time with a second wave, we are almost 7.6% contracting the economy in 2020. As I said, the cumulative GDP loss is about 12.5 trillion, and the reduction in trade is estimated by the WTO to up to 32% in 2020. Commodity prices are plunging, therefore reducing fiscal space in developing countries. Overall, the financing for developing countries is badly affected. Taxes declining, domestic savings are declining, FDI are down, portfolio outflows and remittances down by 20%. This is generating an unprecedented human development crisis, where the ILO estimates that up to 300 million of jobs are at risk, where the number of food insecure people is projected to increase by almost 130 million, and where extreme poverty by the World Bank is projected to increase by up to 100 million. Other estimates are much more pessimistic, put the number up to 500 million people falling into poverty. This is on top of multiple crises that developing countries are already facing, notably the food, climate, and security in places like West Africa, the limited reach of health and social protection system, and very vulnerable production structure in most countries, notably in Africa. If we just move, and this will be my last point, to one specific example of how the pandemic is having a lasting impact that goes beyond the current situation. If you look at digital divide, of course, the pandemic has impacted our children in school. And this is an example from Latin America, where 154 million students have been affected by the closure of schools and the movement to remote learning and distance learning. But of course, not every family, not every children have the same opportunities in terms of having a computer that is connected to the internet, or having parents that can support the learning of the child. And this is a way that we summarize the differences. If you look at Latin America as a whole, and you differentiate between students that are coming from a poor background versus students that are coming from a more privileged background, you will see that only 14% of students from a poor background in primary education have a computer connected to the internet versus more than 80% in affluent families. Now, we know already that these two groups of students perform very differently when it comes to measuring the learning outcomes. The difference between a student from a poor family and one from a more affluent family, exactly in the same level of schools, when measured in terms of mathematics and science, can be measured in a difference of almost 4 years of learning. So the fact that there are these digital divides is further exacerbating differences in learning, and we know that human capital, which is lost, has a long-lasting impact on the opportunities in life. So this is just to say that the crisis is not only having impact now, but will have an impact going on for many generations, and we need to act swiftly. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Federico, for the presentation and for the main point of view of the need for international cooperation, the need that we consider the situation with the developing countries, the digital divide, and the impact for the future generations. So by this, I'm going to provide some of the questions that we received from the audience, and some of them are very specific to certain topics, and some of them are general for general discussion. So the first one is about China. So I think Dr. Wang is going to be responding to this one. It says that because of COVID-19, lots of economic and industrial sectors were negatively impacted because of the concentration of the production in China. So do you think that this current crisis would lead to a more diversified approach of the manufacturers to move away from China? So you can have spread for the sources of manufacturing to other countries.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful and very important question about manufacturing. So actually, I think that in terms of my observation and my research, based on the database of Chinese bureau, I think that it depend which kind of the manufacturing. So I think they have originated from 3 levels. One level is that from the domestic China policy, because in the since 2013, our government, our central government policy push some low prices, low value manufacturing chains to move out of our countries. So this, in terms of the a lot of way, including capacity cooperation, something like that. So it's very it's our active policy to push the capacity cooperation. So this is the first level. Second level is that because of the trade war between U.S. and China since 2 years ago. 2 years ago, United States launched a trade war to China and added a tariff to a lot of Chinese productions. So just some very few factory in East China, they moved to the Southeast Asia, and in order to avoid the tariff, and then the third level is, as the question said, that because of the COVID-19, maybe some of the manufacturing move out of China. But my answer is that even those moving out of China in the manufacturing fields, China still now, especially this year, China will exceed United States and to become the largest market, consumption market. And also China still the largest manufacturing country. The total value of manufacturing is 1.5 times than United States, which is the second manufacturing country. So I think that why? Because China still has the three advantages. One advantage is that the infrastructure. China has a very good infrastructure, as we all know, right? Including the 5G network, including the high railway, high subway, something like that. Second is that our labor skill, compared to the development country, compared to those developing country, our labor's price is still very valued, because we have the natural, combine a lot of advantage, right? With not very high prices, labor prices, but very high skilled capacity. Third advantage is that I think that China's policy, China's social policy, economic policy, something like that. China's society is very stable. We keep the very stable society, and our city is very safe, without a gun, without disorder, without a child. So I think that above all, I still keep the self-confidence for the China manufacturer's future in past COVID-19 period. This is my answer. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. A question, I think, for Mr. Ahmed about the impact of COVID-19 on the GCC countries or oil producing and exporting countries mainly, and how do you see the road to recovery for those countries, especially while you mentioned that you have this reverse role for the fiscal policy, where you have to cut expenditures while you are under the current crisis. So, what do you see the future, and how they can get back to the recovery?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, and for the question asked. Again, I would like to focus on maybe the recovery side of the question, because we talked about the potential impact quite a lot in the different sessions. And when the point was made on the implementing the right policies at the right time, and how we can learn from previous lessons and previous crises, where some policies were counterproductive. They especially in terms of fiscal policy, which in the GCC, because of the peg to the local currencies to the dollars, the room in the or the options in monetary policies are not as flexible as the fiscal policies. So the examples from previous experiences show us that some, and this differs between countries within the GCC, but mostly fiscal policies that were implemented in the past weren't, they were counter-cyclical. So cutting spending when the economy is not doing very well, putting more harm, especially to the non-oil sector, where in fact you should be prioritizing helping these firms and helping your private sector to survive, helping and protecting households and vulnerable groups. But just to give a very broad road to recovery, and I think this can be applied to the GCC and to other regions around the world, is obviously we are in a panic mode now, in a pandemic situation. So the first priority has to be to deal with the health situation. So ensure that you're dealing with infection rates, protecting people, lives, and health. So thankfully, the GCC countries have well-equipped, as I said, health systems. Expenditure on health system is on a healthy level. There is always room to be more efficient, more mobilize better, more productive resources to the health sector. So this is the first priority. Once you're past or you're ensured that the right policies from a health perspective are in place, and we've seen them in the GCC, you have to complement that with the right economic policies in terms of both fiscal and monetary policies. So again, for monetary policies, you're kind of restricted because of the currency peg to the dollars. So already the interest rates in the GCC are at a very low level. So in terms of fiscal policies, we've seen some attempts in the GCC countries to spend and stimulate the economy, mostly where in giving the banking sector more liquidity space, but also some, as Dr. Ahmed mentioned, some cuts in. As Dr. Bongalia mentioned, some reduction in tax cuts and tax reliefs. I think what we've seen is also not very much coordinated effort in terms of fiscal policies between the GCC. So this is one area where the GCC country can work on and improve. And finally, once these fiscal policies and monetary policies are in place to help, as I said, vulnerable groups such as SMEs, a segment in the private sector, and households and labor market, then the third stage is to seriously, and again, this is always happens after each crisis in the GCC, is to have serious implementation of your diversification and sustainable growth agenda going forward. So again, this is a lesson always been brought to the front page. The vulnerability of the oil and dependency of the GCC market, and how that's vulnerable to their fiscal position. So going forward, once you passed this and you made sure that you reduced the recession as much as possible, third and final stage is to try to really implement your diversification and sustainable growth agenda going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed. Now, a question for Dr. Omar about the homogeneity of results of COVID-19, regardless of the lockdown on countries. The question says that given the homogeneity of results, despite variation in policies, what country or countries are you seeing as doing fairly well as a potential model of good practice?
Thank you for the question. So I should say that I'm not a public health expert, I'm an economist. So this view is only suggestive. But I think that several things we can agree on in general are that, first of all, having a good contact tracing system is important. So once you determine who does and hasn't have a disease, it's important that you're able to see where they've gone and who they've interacted with. And secondly, you also need to have random widespread testing. So those two together give you the best chance of being able to contain the virus, as far as I can tell from an economist's perspective. And in that regard, countries that seem to be doing well are unsurprisingly countries that had experience with SARS around 10 years ago. So we're talking about China, South Korea, Singapore, and I believe Vietnam also falls into that category. And probably if this situation were to repeat itself in the future, we would find that many countries in the West, for whom this is the first experience of the major pandemic, would also have acquired these skills. But I had to stress that these are all beyond the fact that I'm not a public health expert. No one has solved the problem yet. And it will take another 2 or 3 years for us to be able to look back and be more definitive about what does work well and what doesn't, and which country ended up having the best model. If we take the case of Sweden, which is very divisive, so it's been criticized for the adverse health consequences on the purely medical side, but at the same time, their unemployment rate has not increased by anywhere near as much as it has in many other countries. And secondly, because they haven't imposed a lockdown and schools have been open, the mental health of their society has been much higher than it has in many other countries. And so what the country that is a good model in terms of whether people died or not is not necessarily the same as the country that is a model for people in terms of the general well-being of the population. And for that, we won't know. It could be the case that 2 or 3 years from now, we'll find that having children locked away from schools for 6 months, 9 months causes long-term psychological damage. We've already had mentioned that some of society's most vulnerable people, such as women who are victims of domestic abuse, children who are victims of domestic abuse, and so on and so forth, are the people who've suffered the most. And we cannot assess that with we cannot incorporate that into our analysis of which countries are a model until the passage of at least another couple of years.
Thank you. Now, because of the time limit, we have one question left for Mr. Federico. It's about the stimulus packages, fiscal and monetary, and it says that large stimulus packages are redistributive. For example, loan deferral disproportionately benefit large corporates with high debt, with the cost borne by banks that take hits to equity. How should these long-term implications be addressed? The implications of the stimulus packages for the exceptional policies that we are taking right now.
Well, as I said, we are navigating uncharted waters because the situation is clearly quite unique, and the spread of the lockdowns, the consequences of the lockdowns is such that we are confronted with a heat that is affecting not a single sector. It is affecting a variety of sectors, from tourism to the banking sector to manufacturing to services, etc., etc. So this is demanding an unprecedented injection of liquidity and support into the OECD and G20 countries' economies. So on one hand, it's very difficult to answer this question given the amount of resources and the spread of the crisis. On the other hand, we have learned something from the global financial crisis. And I think that there are important lessons learned in terms of how to condition the use of state support in ways that is not generating, if you want, unfair competition, or that is not wasting taxpayers' money to the profit of shareholders only. And so I think that here the discussion is ongoing. There are, of course, important aspects of how to use equity participation and how to make sure that this equity is used not to distort markets, to ensure a sound recovery and to maintain employment levels. But I think that one of the lessons that we learned from the previous crisis is that the time has come to focus this measure on people and on employment, and on ensuring that the recovery is one where issues like environmental sustainability, inequalities are put at the center of the response. So there are clearly technicalities and technical aspects that can be discussed in terms of how to extend this support and how to ensure that there are no abuses and that corporations are accountable, transparent, etc., etc. But I think that we should beside these more technical discussions that are ongoing, we should put the focus on what the objective of these exceptional stimulus packages should be. I think that a people-centered and sustainable development center type of stimulus is what we need this time, and is one that should not be focused only on domestic economies, but should take into account the spillover effects on developing countries, and the fact that the lack of investment that has been made in the past in developing countries is part of this problem. And if we don't have a truly global recovery, there will be no recovery. And so investing in Africa, investing in Latin America, investing in Southeast Asia and South Asia is fundamental if we want to ensure that vulnerabilities that were there before the crisis and that are being exacerbated now will not be at the root of a deglobalization and a move to that is raising years of progress in terms of poverty, human development, etc.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Trends, I would like to thank you all for the very informative and very important symposium and the diversified points of view that we cover today, from the worrying signs of how to deal with COVID-19 and how the situation is still not under control completely with the 40 varieties of COVID-19 that have been discovered. But at the same time, we have to take into account that there is sort of still confusion about the situation and how to deal with it. This is very important to just like focusing on the facts, focusing on not to go beyond into fake news and so on. At the same time, thank you very much for Mr. Ahmed for the insights that he gave to us about the situation with the GCC countries, especially with the role of fiscal policy and how we can get into the next stage of recovery, taking into consideration the constraints of the policies here. And finally, for Mr. Federico, about highlighting the impact on the developing countries and how we need international cooperation, not only in the sense of ODA or official development assistance, but also to stimulate the investments for developing countries in order to eliminate the impact on inequality, and for having this year as the first year where we have an increase in poverty in the century. So again, thank you so much for the insights, and on behalf of Trends, I would like to make just one last announcement. The announcement is about the next E-Symposium, which is going to be at 6 p.m. UAE time, July 8th, about the role of space in sustainable development. And Dr. Simonita Di Pipo, the manager of the UN Office for Space Affairs, is going to have the key speech here, and we will have a number of representatives from different institutions for space affairs from the US, Russia, Japan, and some other countries. So we are looking forward to you for the attendance for this event. And again, thank you so much.